You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Farhad. I hope you are all well and safe. I'm excited to have Patrick Kane on the show for a second time. How are you, Pat?
Hey Farhad, how are you? How's everything going?
I'm doing great, man. I really appreciate you hopping on again. As we kind of went through the previous time that you were on, we've known each other for many, many years, going back to our Guardsmark days. Get ready for this, 25 years ago.
Yeah,
That
hard
just,
to imagine.
it sounds crazy to think about that. So, Pat is one of the most giving people I know. He is an incredible resource for me and many others in our industry. And when I was thinking about how I describe you, I'd almost say that you're the center of the Venn diagram that has connected many people. So thank you for everything that you do, Pat. So I was hoping we could start with a high level overview of your background and career.
Sure, absolutely, and I certainly appreciate all the kind words, Farhad, and it's an honor that you had me back on the podcast as well as a guest. So, I guess in terms of career, I work for an organization that has operations all over the world. I've been in the private sector now for probably almost, I'd say, 30 years. I was a Marine Corps infantry officer before I entered the private sector. And as I was heading out of the Marine Corps, I was interested in pursuing something that would be interesting and challenging, and here I am. And my organization I'm at now has a lot of international operations, so I spend a lot of time oriented on protection of our travelers and personnel who are overseas, and that's everything from the intel side of the house, understanding the areas that we're sending people to and what the potential issues are, to employing all the steps that we need to ensure that they're safe there, and that can be protection teams, it can be secure transportation and drivers and so forth. And then when there are issues, I'm responsible for responding when there are incidents or other types of crises.
Yeah, no, and obviously I've tracked your career, and I know you've traveled to some interesting parts of the world. So we're really leveraging a ton of experience in having Pat talk today. So one of the things that's changed, Pat, from the last time that you were on to this, I think it was like 3 years ago or something like that you
Sounds
were on
about right.
when we first started. So is that we're starting off with a softball session, just asking some lighthearted questions to kind of get things rolling. So first one is, what I was going to ask you is, where did you grow up and how did you get into the security business? But I want to switch it up a little bit. I still want to know where you grew up, and I want to know how you became a Marine. Like what led to that?
Okay, well, I grew up in Manhattan, actually, in NYC, and I don't think I ever, was a child. I didn't aspire to being in this industry, but I think I was always somewhat cognizant the industry existed, um, because of the fact that my father was a FBI agent, and he worked for a while as a corporate investigator after that. So I was kind of exposed to the fact that these positions existed and so forth. But if you recall back in time to the 70s and 80s, the industry was not the same as it is now. As far as the Marine Corps, I think I was always interested in the Marine Corps from an early age, but I always kind of knew it was something I wanted to spend a short time in, and then head out to something else or something new. So yeah, I think a lot of the same type of things. I think I wanted a challenge. I think I wanted something that was going to be interesting, something that was somewhat different, something that I could be able to say afterwards. I was able to contribute something. I think all those factors all played into it.
Sure. You know what? All these years, I never knew your dad was an FBI agent.
Yeah, I don't know if we ever talked about it before. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, wow. And like he was based out of New York, or
yep, he was.
so like was he like like a full term like New York agent or?
No, he started in D.C., then he was in Atlanta, and he was in New York before I was actually born. and I was probably about 2 or 3 years old when he actually was out of the FBI and into the private sector at that point.
Well, that's really interesting. So, like, obviously, you've had a long career and doing a bunch of different things. Are there any? Is there a moment or moments that really stick out during your career?
Yeah, I think there are probably quite a few, Farhad. I mean, I think one of the advantages that I've been able to have in this particular career is the ability to travel, see a lot of places, experience a lot of things, and I think that you had said I've been in some crazy places, and I have, and I've been in some places which are pretty normal too. But I think the ability to kind of see so many places. Yeah, I was in Kuwait for the start of the Second Gulf War uh, in 2003. I've been to Afghanistan a variety of separate times when the conflict was happening in Afghanistan. So I've been able to see, I think, a lot of historical types of things or things that have been prominent in current affairs um, on the ground and in a small way. I don't claim to have been able to see everything or necessarily have a great understanding of it, but at least to have had some exposure to events that have been so impactful in our world. And then, yeah, in terms of travel, I mean, I've been to over 70 countries. I think I've been on 6 of the 7 continents, everywhere but Antarctica. And I think because of the nature of the job I have to kind of understand the environment somewhat. So I won't, I won't claim to be an expert on any place I've traveled at all to, but I've always had to know enough or understand enough about the culture and the people and the politics and this and the social interactions to be able to understand both things I need to be concerned about for my own personal safety, but also things I need to be concerned about for our travelers as well.
Sure. No. So, do you have a favorite place in the world, or is that too hard of a question?
Actually it's a hard question. I usually have a hard time with anything involving favorites. I do like in terms of regions. I think I like Southeast Asia probably best.
Okay.
Um, but every place I've traveled, I've either learned something new or seen something interesting or something like that. So it's hard to say a certain area is a favorite for me.
Well, I appreciate the Southeast Asia, and I know you're not catering to the host. So,
No, I'm not, but I am headed over that way actually in a week or two here. So yeah,
are you really?
yeah,
Well,
yeah. I'm going to
that's
be in Bangladesh, Thailand here in a few days.
oh wow. Okay. Well, things have calmed down over there, so it should be a little bit better, hopefully.
Yep.
Um, so, can you talk about some of your mentors, like who's influenced your career and I guess just where you are today?
Yeah, I think I can't say I've ever really had what I would call a traditional mentor. So I've never really had a situation where there was somebody where I went to them for advice on a variety of different things and so forth. I would say I've had more a group of mentors through my career, and they basically have been in two areas. The first one being just more generally things involving leadership and a lot of the things I've learned in that area have been through the examples of other people that I've seen and admired and followed, and that goes back to when I was in the Marine Corps, probably even prior, but and is happening even now. But I wouldn't really hone in on a certain individual. And then the other one is more on the technical side and the tactical side, as far as understanding things and so forth. So I tend to like to try to find people who are very knowledgeable in a certain area and try and find out as much as I can from that person uh, about things in that area of specialization. So, we had a consultant who did a lot of stuff on crisis management and responding to incidents, and I spent a lot of time with him, asking him um, how he would handle certain situations and how he handled things when they came up and so forth.
Mhm.
And I've had other individuals who've been, smarter than I am, which is easy on security systems and CCTV and things like that. So
Right.
trying to kind of find out what I can from them, from both understanding how to employ it, but understanding what the vulnerabilities are too, how it can be overcome, and so forth. So it probably sounds like a bit of a cop out answer, but the reality is it's been a pool of people over time, and I think it's ever evolving. because I'm always kind of searching for people I can kind of learn from in certain areas.
Sure. No, I mean that's a fair answer. That I was waiting to see if I'd hear some names from the past, but I'm glad you didn't throw it out there and spoke about it
Yeah,
generally.
I wouldn't throw out any of those. And one thing too, I have to say, when you're throwing out names,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to be concerned that you'll overlook a person who is influential,
Yeah.
just out of happenstance. But I will say, to my time there, my early time in the security industry, first starting out at Guardsmark, I
Yeah.
did I did learn a lot, particularly about how the industry works from a variety of separate people who we all shared as you know as colleagues.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Me too. So I mean, a lot of people have their roots there. So I appreciate that, and hopefully that was a softball for you. So obviously, there's been some notable events in recent times that have once again, I think, shifted the focus of many companies and individuals to start thinking about security perhaps a little bit differently. As I was mentioning to you before we hopped on and started recording, I reread the blog that you did for us a few years ago, entitled "Three Ways to Improve Your Personal Security," and it made me think about having you, and that's the, I guess, metamorphosis of how we end up here, to kind of talk about that a little bit. So if it's okay, I have a few questions for you. So
Sure, of course.
let's talk about personal security. What do you think are the primary components to personal security?
Think the primary things that you need to think about, well, I think it's important we empower both ourselves and individuals who work for us, and they can be employees or travelers or contractors, whomever. But I think it's important that the individual relies on himself or herself instead of depending on external parties all the time for their own safety and security. And I think that's one of the obstacles we really have to overcome in our society, that there's a tendency to think that that our personal safety is somebody else's responsibility, when in reality it's ours. But as far as three important areas or components, I think the first one is more on the intel side, and it's understanding the environment, and that can be the environment that's your home base. It can be the environment you're working in. It can be the environment you have to go transit through, or for people who travel, the environments that you're traveling to. So understanding what the issues are in those areas, and then understanding how it might impact you. How, depending on your own personal profile and depending on the activity that you're going to be involved in, how might the threats in that environment potentially impact you and help you evaluate and assess the overall risk. And then the other one, or the second one I would focus on, is being aware of your environment. So understanding what's happening around you and understanding also how that may impact you, and trying to see incidents before they become a reality. And then the third one, the final one, is being equipping yourself to make a decision off the information you have in a quick manner. And I don't mean an impulsive decision necessarily. It should be informed, but being able to inform yourself about what's going on in your environment and decide something and act upon it quickly. And of course, there's a lot there, so I can unpack those either now or separately if you like
Yeah. No,
into
no,
a greater detail.
sure. Why don't you, if you could talk about, because I'd like to get back to that because I think it'll round out the episode. Is Can you talk about the types of like attacks? I
Sure.
thought that was one of the things that you did brilliantly on this blog, and I don't think people necessarily think about it in those terms. So if you could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, in general, I would split it into three categories, and I should say at the beginning of this, and for the majority of the things I'm going to talk about, a lot of the things I'm talking about, these are not my ideas, right? These are things that I've discovered over time, and my experience uh, enhances them maybe, but they're not things I came up with necessarily on my own. So I just want to be sure I put that out there early on. But basically, in terms of attacks, I think you're looking at three types basically. The first one's a targeted attack, and in a targeted attack, you are selected in advance as a victim. So envision a scenario where you're a CEO of a controversial company, You may have people who are targeting you specifically because they're interested in making a statement against yourself personally or against your organization, against your industry. So that would be a targeted attack. The next kind would be opportunistic, and opportunistic is a kind that a lot of us think about, I think, or the kind we're probably more likely to encounter.
Yep.
Opportunistic means you're kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. You come to the attention of people who have bad intentions, and they size you up and evaluate you as an easy victim, and you end up being victimized. This will be, like pickpocketing, a street mugging, a bag snatching, anything that happens somewhat. Again, I wouldn't call it impulsively, but it happens with a short string, and they're not necessarily out to target Patrick or Farhad or Joe or whomever. They're
Yep.
out to go target somebody who fits a profile, and it just happens that you fall into that profile. And then the third one is collateral or incidental. And I would say that, for a lot of people, particularly travelers, this is a concern. And this is also another situation of being in a bad place at a bad time, but you're not being selected as the victim. But basically, you're just in the middle of a situation and it goes bad. And that can be you go walk into a store and it's being held up at the time, and you just become automatically a victim, or you're in the area and there's a protest that ends up turning violent and you get swept up in that violence. Or there's a incident involving terrorism and you just happen that you're on scene when that occurs, and end up getting injured or killed as a result of that. So it's something that's not aimed at you. You're not being targeted in any manner, but you just happen to be in a kind of bad situation when it plays out.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's just great framework. So, what about the attack cycle? Can you talk about how these things happen and generally the way it plays out?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. The attack cycle applies for opportunistic attacks and targeted attacks. We generally think about it more for targeted attacks, but the reality is it occurs in opportunistic attacks as well too. And the concept of the attack cycle probably first started to come to the forefront in like the 1970s or 80s, in response to a lot of attacks that were happening involving terrorism. At that time you had like the Bader Meinhof group, and you had the Popular Liberation of Palestine and so forth, that were very active in targeting both American diplomats, military personnel, and so forth. But the idea of the attack cycle is there are steps that are followed that are involved in pretty much every attack. And depending on the model you may have learned, they're usually between like 6 and 8 steps. So you see 6 or 7 are very common. But essentially, to break it down, your first step is an initial type of surveillance. In this stage, you have the adversary, and it could be a criminal, it could be a terrorist, it could be whomever, is trying to find a suitable target. They're looking across the landscape of potential targets to try to find a suitable target. As you go into the second phase, you get into target selection. So, based off the information that adversary has been able to gather in their surveillance, in their initial surveillance, they decide on a suitable target. And it can be an individual, it can be a facility, but it's somewhere where they are seeing certain vulnerabilities that they're able to exploit that make it an attractive target. Once they've decided on that target, they go into phase three, which is the pre-attack surveillance. So let's say you're focusing on an individual and you're intending on targeting them for kidnapping or assassination. So when you're at the stage where you have your particular victim selected, you start to monitor their movements. You start to look at their timings. What time do they leave their home or their hotel if they're staying in a hotel? What time do they arrive in the office? How do they transit between A and B? All these things, and that's actually the time where you ideally get an opportunity to intersect or intercede with this if you're aware of your environment. From the part about the pre-attack surveillance, they move into planning, and some of this can happen simultaneously, but this is basically considered to be about the fourth step in the plan. So, using the information that they've gathered from that pre-attack surveillance, they start to work on a plan, understanding areas where you're going to be vulnerable, understanding times when you're more exposed and so forth, and coming up with a plan. From the plan, they go into rehearsal, which is step number 5. And rehearsal is basically being able to practice the steps to the point where they're smooth and fluid, and the attacker or the adversary feels that they can carry them out in a effective way without being interrupted or caught or what have you. From rehearsal, they go into stage 6, which is execution. And execution is kind of self-explanatory. Execution is the point where they carry out the attack itself, whatever it is. It could be a kidnapping, it could be a bombing, it could be a variety of separate things. An assassination, it could be an armed robbery, a variety of different things. And then the final step, or step 7, in the model I'm using anyway, is escape. And in the case of some instances, exploitation as well. So they obviously, in the majority of cases, unless it's a suicide operation, the adversary wants to escape after they've carried out the attack. And in cases involving terrorism, there's also often an exploitation aspect as well, where they want to expose that information to other people to increase their support, or to put certain amount of concern or fear into their potential victims, and so on. So those are kind of the 7 stages, and it's probably easier to see how they play out in a targeted environment like a terrorist attack or a kidnapping, but it does apply in an opportunistic event as well too, but just with a shorter timeline. And if it's helpful, I can speak about how it works on a shorter timeline as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's really critical, because one of the things that I was actually going to point out before you dive into that is,
Yep.
you think about, and I don't want to talk about the specifics because there's so much information out there, but you wrote that blog, and I appreciate you saying that, these aren't your ideas. This is a compilation of information that you've collected over the years, but you wrote that blog several years ago, long before the shooting of Brian Thompson, right? But then if you listen to what you're saying about the cycle and how, generally how it works, I mean, it's probably almost identical to how Luigi Mangione kind of carried out his attack on him as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you look back historically at the majority of incidents, you'll find these elements in there. You may find incidents where certain elements are not as pronounced or as obvious, and there's some things that you're not going to always necessarily know. But yeah, I think this is pretty accurate description of how it ordinarily ends up playing out in these incidents. Yeah.
Yeah, and the key point there is that this is not theoretical. This is actually, this stuff really happens, right? And so by listening to folks like yourself and others, and sort of implementing some things that we'll talk about in a little bit, you could disrupt that cycle and sort of deter anything from happening. So that's really one of the points of kind of our discussion today. Hopefully people walk away with a couple of things that they could implement that would prevent something like this. So getting back to the shorter cycle, would you mind kind of going through that as well?
Yeah, sure. I'll put the example out that I think I put in the article, or in the post.
Yeah.
So, as I said, it's easy to kind of envision how this would be employed in a kidnapping or an assassination or terrorist attack, etc. It's a little harder to understand an opportunistic attack like a street mugging. But in that type of scenario, stop and think about it. You're walking on the street, right? Other people are walking the street at the same time, and there's a group of individuals out there who are intending to stop somebody who would have basically and mug them. Those individuals are kind of scanning the crowd, right? They're looking at who else is walking
Hmm.
um, in the crowd to see who is going to be a probable victim. Are they carrying valuables? Are they somebody who's going to offer them a problem or resist, or something like that? All those things are going to be important as they evaluate what the different options are in terms of potential victims in their environment. So that's kind of the first stage we talked about, the initial surveillance. Then
Hmm.
they select a target. So of that group of people, they decide Farhad is the ideal target. He's sporting a lot of gold jewelry. He doesn't seem like he's going to fight back. He's distracted. He's got his head in his phone, which is something else we could talk about. But he's got his head in his phone. So he ends up as a target. So then, as they have decided that Farhad is the target, they start to look at the surroundings, right? This is kind of analogous to the stage 3 where they are conducting their like surveillance before carrying out the attack. And this is going to be very, very squeezed into a short period of time and compressed. It could be a matter of seconds, but they're looking to see who's around. Are there any police in the area? Is there someone else who might interfere? Are there exits, which are, escape routes, which are easily available, and so forth. And then in terms of planning, this is probably one of the ones that is not as common, but they either will come up with a quick plan themselves, or more likely they have a game plan or a modus operandi that they operate off of in these type of scenarios, and everybody involved on that adversary side is going to understand what they have to do. Rehearsal as well. This is a little bit different, but you can see a rehearsal. It can manifest itself in terms of a criminal interview, and a criminal interview basically is where you have somebody who walks up to you and poses a question, either to distract you or to get some kind of a sense of your response, right? So are you going to be, if they walk up to you and ask you something unexpectedly, are you going to be shocked and timid and shy away? Are you going to respond assertively? What type of response are you going to have with that interaction, which is going to help them in the final stage too, in confirming that you are a suitable victim. And then execution, is kind of self-explanatory, and so is escape. So, and you're not going to have exploitation with an example like I just put out there, but you could kind of see all those elements. It's happening a lot faster. It's not happening as intensively, but but all those elements, or the majority of those elements, are still present. And it's still, as with the other instances we talked about, which are more targeted, it still comes down to kind of intercepting them as early in that cycle as possible, and being able to see it's happening and take action as early as possible.
Sure. Now, look, I commute around New York City, so that scenario is a reality for not only me, but really everybody else every single day, right? Because there's so much stuff that's going on around us that, if you're not aware, like you said, you could very easily become a victim. So so let's talk about the key components to staying safe. What in your, I first of all, I love the first point you made about we are responsible for our own safety and security, and you shouldn't rely on others as the primary means, right? I think that is just such a brilliant point to make. And so, what are those things? What are the things that will increase your chances of not becoming a victim?
I think it's when you focus on the three things I talked about earlier, and I'll discuss each of them more extensively right now, but really understanding the environment. And it starts with our home environment, the area that our neighborhood, and so forth, and then the areas that we work in, the areas we have to transit, and so forth. So understanding what the issues are in those environments, being able to kind of know, if I'm in an area where there's a big problem concerning pickpocketing, I need to be especially concerned about my wallet, or my phone, or other things I'm carrying that would be potentially attractive for a pickpocket, and storing them in a manner where they're not going to be as accessible, as an example. Whereas I might have a separate focus if the primary concern was kidnapping or something like that. So understanding what the issues are, and as granularly as possible, both in terms of geography, in terms of the area or neighborhood, and also in terms of the type of tactics that are employed. Because if you can understand that, it's going to help you see when something is playing out. There's a scam that the variations of it are played on throughout the world, where someone will spill something on you. They'll squirt mustard on you or something like that, in order to serve as like a distraction and throw you off base and things like that. If you know in advance that is a concern, and you're walking somewhere, you're on vacation in Italy, and you're at a piazza somewhere, and you're walking, and suddenly somebody spills something on you or squirts something on you, apparently by accident, but maybe not, this is a precursor for something else, right? But if you didn't have that information, you would think, well, this is an accident. So understanding the kind of things that happen in that environment is going to be important to seeing things as early as possible, like we talked about in the attack cycle. And to the extent that you travel as well too, understanding, trying to inform yourself before you travel of the type of activities that happen in those areas that you're headed to is going to help you in the same way. So I think that's a kind of a critical part on that intel side and that understanding the environment. Situational awareness and being able to be familiar with what's happening around you, which is also, I guess, a matter of understanding the environment, but more in kind of real terms and in a more of a macro view, like we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
So you hear people a lot of times are going to say you need to be aware of your surroundings or be vigilant or be or pay attention or what have you. And all that information is good, right? It's not that those comments are bad; they're helpful, but they're not. It's not enough information. It's not enough tools for somebody to operate off of. And if I was going to emphasize a single thing of the three, I think that that being aware of your surroundings as you go through your day is probably the primary thing that's going to help you in terms of staying safe. And we have a lot of challenges with that now because you people, they're on their smartphone, they have AirPods in, they're not paying attention to what's happening around them. I mean, you see when you're on the subway and things like that, the majority of folks are not particularly clued into what's happening. They've got their head in a book or their phone or something like that. So understanding what's going on is important around you, and it's important to understand the concept of a baseline, and particularly for areas that we're familiar with when we're on our home turf, it's easier to establish a baseline than it is when we're traveling in a foreign environment. But I would argue that we can accomplish it everywhere. And what that basically is understanding what behavior or activity is considered to be normal for that environment. So if I go into a Starbucks, as an example, if I go into a Starbucks coffee shop, I'm going to see people queuing up at the line to order. I'll see people working on their computers. I'll see people having conversations at a table, maybe something like that. If I see something that's not in the realm of things that I normally see, if there's a guy who's sitting at the table but he doesn't have a coffee in front of him and he's staring into space, it doesn't necessarily mean that that individual is a problem or a threat, but it is an anomaly. It's something out of the ordinary. So understanding things in a certain environment that we can expect, which are normal in terms of activity and behavior, and then understanding things which are anomalies, which is the either the presence of something that you wouldn't expect there, so a person behaving in a way that's uncommon or unusual, or the absence of something that you would expect. So if you stop at the same store on the way home from work every day and pick up a soda, let's say, and whenever you go in there at that particular time, it's crowded, and you go in there one day and it's empty. That's an anomaly. That's the absence of something that you would expect at that time in that environment, and it can be a sign of a problem. I mean, are the employees and customers, are they all tied up in the back room? I don't know.
Yeah,
It's also very often it's an innocent thing, but just being able to kind of see that and appreciate that is a pretty substantial advantage, I think, when we're talking about your personal safety. So each of those aspects, understanding the either the presence of something abnormal or the absence of something that you would expect or consider to be normal in that environment is going to
sure,
be is going to be important.
sure. No, that's all very, very helpful. So it's interesting because like in the news, and this is not like a professional sort of situation. This is a kid that went on, I guess, spring break, but the situation down in like the Dominican
Yep.
Republic with the young girl Sidiksha Kananki, and basically gone missing, and like you could see, like as you talk about all the different things, and there's probably alcohol involved there, which is another component of it, but all of the things that you're saying, you could see had, comes into play.
Yep.
You know what I
Yep.
mean?
You're hitting on all of them. Yes, and alcohol is certainly a factor. One of the
Yeah,
other things that's a factor in these things are inherent biases, right?
right.
So we often want to assume things are okay and normal, right? We want to explain things away. So in my example, you see something out of the ordinary, you come up with a plausible explanation. Well, this person's acting this way because of X, Y, and Z, or it's probably nothing. And
Right.
stop and think, and this is all of us, including me. How many times have we had that happen where we see something that seems like it's not quite right? but we try and
Yeah.
explain it away as, oh, it's not important or impactful on us.
Right, right. So yeah, as you know, like the show is called Investigation Insiders. We try to peel back the layers, and what we've learned is our listeners like anecdotes to kind of bring everything together. So, are you able to share a story or two to kind of help demonstrate both failures and successes, exercising the tips that you talked about?
Yeah, I could think of one from my personal life actually.
Yeah.
Myself and my wife were on vacation in Turks and Caicos back in the mid 2000s, and we went out to eat. And at the time, and it's changing somewhat now that there's are some concerns about crime, I think, to a higher extent now. But at the time that we were down there, it was fairly safe, particularly in comparison with other islands in the Caribbean. That's partially how come we chose it because I was implementing all the things I'm talking about now. I was researching things for what places have higher crime and what places are safer and so forth, and it was considered to be a safer place. So we go out to eat at a place that's a couple blocks from the hotel we were staying at, and had a pleasant meal, outdoors, a courtyard and so forth. And we walk back to the hotel, and the hotel was kind of set back off the main road. And between the hotel and the main road, there's a big parking lot. So we're coming off the main road, we're walking the parking lot, and she was the one who saw it first, actually, that there was a lot of activity happening in the lobby of the hotel. And this is evening, so it's pretty easy to see what's going on because the interior of the hotel has on all the interior lights and whatnot. So there's a lot of commotion happening inside of the hotel. So we stop for a second and pause, and then I could see that there are people inside the hotel. They're carrying either shotguns or potentially rifles in the hotel. I'm like, well, that's a problem. So we squat down behind one of the cars in the parking lot, and I called the phone number for emergency services in Turks and Caicos. And people often ask me, well, how did you have that number? But I had it actually because I had researched in advance about the uh, before I was traveling there, and I had that in my information. I stored it in my cell phone. So I called up, and basically I'm trying to explain, hey, I'm outside Hotel XYZ, and this is what's going on inside. And the operator, the individual I was speaking to, like he wasn't believe. He's like, no, that's not possible. That couldn't be happening there. That stuff, it doesn't happen here, and so forth. I'm like, well, I'm seeing it happen right now. So as I'm having this conversation, and we're hunched down behind this car in the parking lot, the individuals who are armed come pouring out of the lobby. They hop into a vehicle that's parked on the side road. It's like a little service area alongside the hotel, and it speeds off. Like the tires are squealing and everything, the whole nine.
Mm.
And we approached the hotel, still somewhat cautiously, I think, after that happened. We get in the front lobby. Everybody's on their cell phones. Everybody's on their cell phones in there. And I asked one of the employees, I said, hey, what happened here? Were you held up or something? And they're like, no, no, sir, everything is fine. Just go to your room. I started laughing. Um, but I think from that particular incident, you could see a lot of the things that we're talking about are
Yeah.
playing out. We could easily have been on our phones or talking, not paying attention to what was going on, and so forth, and strolled into the middle of that situation.
Yeah.
Or we could have been curious or played it down and said, "Oh, it's probably nothing," and had the same thing happen. But because of the fact that she saw there was a problem early on, and then we went and found ourselves a position where we somewhat were concealed. We could see what was going on, but we somewhat were concealed from anybody in the hotel being able to see us. We felt like we were fairly safe at that time. And then the fact that even though it didn't ultimately help, the fact that I had the phone number for the emergency services in the country at least provided me the option of contacting them when I saw something was happening. So all those factors, plays into the intelligence, being able to make a decision quickly and to decide that we wanted to stay where we felt it was safe, um, and being aware of our environment in the first place to the extent that it was something we saw as we approached the hotel. So I think that's a kind of an example that I think plays out a lot of the points. But I think for yourself, I mean, you kind of grew up as similar to myself in New York City. You grew up in Queens, I grew up in Manhattan. But how many times have you walked across the street because there were a group of people that you saw them up the block and you didn't particularly care for how they looked, or there was somebody who looked like they had mental or emotional problems who was acting out up the street? And if you think about that in our lives, how many times, I think particularly for us because of our backgrounds, do you avoid that situation?
Yep.
But every time you avoid that situation, you can stop and think about, well, if I didn't avoid the situation, how would it potentially have played out? So,
Yep. 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 No, that's a great story. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I'm glad you guys made it out of there okay. So it actually, you know what? I'd like to close out if it's okay with you, because again, I think that as part of like a organization, and there's a lot of organizations actually that might not even know, especially small mid-sized businesses, and as individuals, right? Where are there can you talk about resources out there that might be helpful when you're trying to investigate an environment, understand what the threats are there, things like that. Could you talk about that a little bit?
yeah, I
Emergency
think
phone numbers and stuff like that.
yeah, I think in terms of particularly travel, but actually even within the United States and within your own city and town, you have a lot of resources that are available online that provide you stats on crime in certain areas. Now, some of them are better than others, and some places are covered more accurately or adequately than others. I wouldn't necessarily offer up a certain site, but if you scan on there for if you go on the internet and search up for stuff on crime stats and check a few of them and look at them essentially side by side to see how they compare for the same areas. As I said, it's going to depend within the United States on the area you're in as far as how accurate that is or complete. Internationally, it becomes a lot more challenging, and I have a few comments for international here in a second, but that's an option in the United States. Internationally, the first place I tell people to check would be the State Department. The first site would be at travel.state.gov, which is basically the site where you do your renewal for your passport and everything else. But there's also an area in there for international travel information, and it will provide you information on every country, including a section that covers everything on safety and security from the perspective of the embassy in that area. Now, I will not lie; a lot of the information is high level and somewhat of a generic thing, but it is a good starting point. Also, certain countries will have indicators. This is something they added a short time ago, within the past 2 or 3 years. They've added indicators for certain countries. So if there's a high risk of civil unrest, it'll have an indicator for that. If there's a high risk of kidnapping, it'll have an indicator for that. And those will be in the form of like a K or a U and so forth on the travel information. The next one, which is also a State Department website, is osac.gov. And OSAC is a it's a public-private partnership with the State Department and the private sector for sharing information on security. And the majority of companies of any size in the United States that have international operations are in it. And if you're not in it, you should be. It's entirely free. So if you have an organization where you operate internationally and you're not in OSAC, you should explore that. But even if you're not an OSAC member, even if you're just a private citizen and you're concerned about the place you're headed on vacation or something like that, if you go onto osac.gov, you can still pull a lot of resources that are before you hit the paywall, so to speak. And they have reports on I wouldn't say every country, but a high number of them anyway, which go into a lot more specificity than you find on the other website I mentioned on travel.state.gov. So the OSAC website, you can look and see, and it will provide you information about the country, some of the key cities, and some of the issues which exist here. So if there's a cyber crime threat there, it'll have information about that. If there's a concern about terrorism, information about that. It also oftentimes will include hospitals in the area which are not necessarily approved, but they're hospitals that they are aware of that are commonly accessed by expats and other foreigners who are in that area. So you have a lot of information in terms of research there. Then I would also say look at the similar sites of other countries. So if you look at the UK Foreign Office and so on, and some of this information will be more at the country level, but if you look at several of them, you can kind of see areas where there's consistencies, areas where there's potential gaps, and so forth. I could probably go on and on this topic, but I'll kind of tie it up at that stage or whatever, at least on the intel piece.
Sure. Yeah. One other thing I would add on this, on what you're saying, is, you know, like, depending on where you work, and if obviously there's business travel, and there's personal travel. But if many organizations use third parties that provide reports, like what you mentioned, compiled reports that are sometimes a little bit more specific. So ask your employer if they have anything, and they might share it with you. And sometimes those are helpful because they source multiple sort of places to kind of compile those reports. So that's the only thing I would add.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. If I could just hop in on that, Farhad, because
Yeah,
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I know for myself, I oftentimes have offered input when their individuals were going on a personal trip, and they've asked for, can you help me with some information about, XYZ country? And I'm always happy to. I think it depends a lot on the organization, but yes, on the corporate side, we have a lot of resources that we pay for that can provide a greater degree of exposure. And the other thing you hit on that I think is super important is you want to look at multiple sources, right? You don't ever just want to accept a single source for anything. You always want to look at multiple sources.
yep. No, that's awesome, Pat. So I guess as we wrap up here, just any last words you'd like to say, any takeaways, if you wanted people to walk away with one or two things that from this episode, what would they be?
Well, I think the important thing is to empower yourself, right? Understand that this is something that you need to be responsible for yourself. And if you have people who are under your responsibility or control at work and things of that nature, particularly if you're sending them on travel, empower them with resources and so forth to help them understand themselves. Because reality is, a lot of people, for us, we're in this industry and have been in this industry for a long time. So for us, it's kind of front and center. But for a lot of people, this is kind of a foreign concept. And so I think having individuals understand that this is something that they can influence themselves. It's not all just a matter of it's going to either happen or it's not, but there are things that you're able to act upon. I'd say that's the primary thing. And then, of course, if anybody's got any kind of questions or follow up, I mean, if you would like to go share my stuff on my profile and everything, that's fine.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good segue into the conclusion. So, um, another great episode, Pat. Thank you for your friendship, your professionalism, and your continued willingness to be part of our initiatives, and all the support you've given us over the years. We will put Pat's LinkedIn profile in the description of the podcast. Feel free to also reach out to us, and we could connect you with him. Pat, I just can't thank you enough, man. I really enjoy every conversation we have, and I just can't tell you how much I appreciate our friendship.
It's always excellent for Hod. This was interesting, and as you could kind of see, it's a topic that I'm passionate about and interested in. And like I said, I could go on and on about it. So,
Yep. All right. Well, I'm sure we'll do this again. We may not be recording, but we'll certainly do it again. So
yep, no, I hope so.
yep. Well, thanks again, and thank you to everyone that listens and supports us. Thank you for everything. We couldn't keep doing this without you. So until next time, have a great one.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.